This is part 2 to the first combat video, so if you haven't seen that yet, check it out right here. Damage calculation is what throws a lot of DMs off. Getting it wrong leads to TPKs or boring combats, and I'm not sure which is worse. So in this video, I'm going to go over how I calculate damage for my monsters. Note that the advice is what I personally use for my games. This damage is assuming you'll be doing 1 or 2 combats per day. This is what I found is the actual average for the number of daily combats in a session. Because I and many other DMs do not run the I don't even know how many encounters Wizards of the Coast recommends, but it's far too high. So, what's the damage calculation? Well, not all damage calculations are the same. So I break up my damage calculations for monsters into 5 monster categories: minions, grunts, strong enemies, bosses, and solo monsters. Now I'm going to break down each one of those categories so that you can have an accurate depiction of what each one is and how much damage they should ideally be doing. Firstly, let's start off with minions. When explaining these damage calculations though, we're going to be assuming that in this D&D party, the average character has 100 hit points. So obviously for your party, calculate their average hit points and then match the damage accordingly. So, what's a minion? Well, a minion is an artifact left over from 4th edition that a lot of DMs and myself still use. They are creatures with regular stat blocks, however they have 1 hit point, and if they succeed on a saving throw and would take half damage, they instead take no damage. They're useful for throwing bigger seeming creatures at a party without overwhelming them. You can throw a lot more minions at a group of 5th edition characters than you can just average creatures. But what should their damage be like? Well, your minions' collective average damage, so all of your minions combined, should be one character's total hit points. So, all your minions combined with our, fake party would combine do an average of 100 damage. So if you have 4 minions, they're each doing 25 damage in a round. If you have 10 minions, then they're each doing 10 damage in a round. Pretty simple fare. And I have the damage calculated like this because I like to run my minions as glass cannons because very early on, your party's going to realize, wait a minute, these guys don't actually have the full range of hit points. And without them doing a significant amount of damage, I wouldn't say significant, but beyond what would be expected for that creature, then the party is just going to leave it, and honestly, there will just be a whole bunch of minions left running around at the end of the battle doing puny amounts of damage, and it will just feel boring at the end, like the party is just doing cleanup duty. Therefore, I always suggest running your minions as glass cannons. More damage than you would expect, but very, very little health. Next, let's talk about grunts. These are your bog standard enemies, the basic troops that you're going to fill your battle maps with. They're there to give advantage, take up space, and make combat more dynamic, but they're not there to do a bulk of the damage. Grunts should do 10% of a party member's total health per attack, so 10 damage if the average character's max hit points is 100. Grunts are threats in numbers, but are mostly there to, again, give advantage or some other mechanical benefit. I like using Bulzao, this demon thing, as grunts because their rotting presence is great with multiple other Bulzao. They don't do a ton of damage, but their added secondary mechanical benefit makes combat that much more dynamic. I also like to make sure grunts can be killed by 2 or 3 weak attacks or 1 strong attack. Now, a weak attack would be a cantrip or a first level spell, maybe a glancing melee attack, and a strong attack would be a critical hit or a mid-tier spell. You don't want your grunts to be too tanky. Again, we're trying to find that sweet spot between damage and health. If grunts have health that is too high, then they'll stick around on the battlefield maybe a bit too long and will begin to swarm over your party when in reality, pretty much all the grunts should be dead by the middle of round 2. Whether it be them being purposely focused on because of their mechanical advantages or just the random AoEs taking out grunts by the dozens. For this reason, I lower the health of my grunts if they're too high. The listed HP in the Monsters Manual or whatever book you're using is just the average. You can have a Bulzao, for instance, with 28 hit points raw, rules as written, instead of 52, because again, they're just averages, and you can have a Bulzao who rolled all 1s for their hit die. Hey, Colin from the future here. Went back and I looked up the name of this creature after I recorded this video, and it's actually called Bulazao, so that's a fun fact of the day. And back to the video. Next up, we have our strong enemies. These are your brutes, basically. They're bigger and stronger enemies that you throw in with the grunts for, again, a more dynamic combat. These creatures should be doing 20 to 30% of a character's max hit point total in a round, not per attack. Usually these enemies have more than one attack because they're bigger and stronger and more heavily trained. And they should also be able to survive one or two decent strikes, because when you're running a combat as a DM, nothing will slowly take the, wind out of a player's sails than if they go up to what they think is a brute enemy and they hit it and it just goes down easy without pretty much any resistance. It takes the air out of a combat because they were hoping that this was going to be a stronger enemy if it was doing so much damage, and that taking down a strong enemy, a brute, should be an accomplishment. And so usually the higher amount of damage that a creature is doing should also correlate to a little bit higher hit point total, because the party is going to view that enemy then as an increased threat level enemy. So you're going to want to make it feel good to take down that creature. The only exception to this is minions, but there are a whole bunch of minions on the battlefield. They are not a unique creature. Strong enemies are going to be more unique, and therefore the players are going to place more emphasis on killing them. Next, we're going to talk about a boss monster, and this will seem counterintuitive. If you have a boss with a lot of other enemies around it, they should be doing 15 to 20% of a character's total hit points per attack. And you might be asking, wait, why is this? Isn't the boss supposed to be the most powerful? And the simple reason is, you don't want your boss to get focus fired. You want the general progression of the player's targets to be minions first, because they're their glass cannons. Then you're going to go for the strong enemies because at this point they figured out, oh, these guys are doing a lot of damage. Then after that happens, they go for the boss, and then usually clean up with any other grunts who, are still around. Most of them will probably have been killed off anyway, but after the boss dies, usually you just have the grunts flee. Maybe they come back as villains later. It's pretty standard fare. But to compensate for the damage, your boss should have other abilities that make them unique in a combat. Maybe they have buffs, debuffs, auras, environmental effects, whatnot. But if you have a boss with other enemies helping them, they should not be the primary damage dealer. They need to be doing other things in the combat. At least if you want it to have this fun, dynamic feel. Otherwise, if you have the boss, which is the primary damage dealer, and of course the boss with a bunch of other enemies around, the party's just going to kill the boss right away, and then your boss fight kind of falls a little flat, because you just have a boss fight, but after round one, no boss to fight with. And that feels kind of shitty as both a DM and a player. When I was early on in my DMing journey, this happened to me a lot, until I finally figured out, wait a minute, there are other reasons why the boss can be the boss. And because they're the boss, they're really good at helping other creatures around them. So I started lowering the amount of average damage that my boss monsters did, and immediately I felt my combats get so much better. So take it from me, if you're not doing a solo boss fight, keep that overall damage level on the lower side for your bosses. Have them be the second or third highest damage dealer instead of the first. But now we've probably come to the moment you've all been waiting for, solo bosses. How do we balance a solo boss fight encounter? And this could honestly be a whole video on how to properly balance it, but we're just going to talk about the damage aspect. These boss monsters are what most players and DMs imagine when they think of a big boss fight. A solo boss is a boss that fights alone or with a few grunts. They're not surrounded by a horde of grunts, but they have a few to, again, make that combat a little bit more dynamic so that you're not just hitting this giant monster or small little lich guy for 3 rounds. Ideally for damage, these solo bosses need to do 35 to 45% of a character's max HP per hit. Yes, per hit. 35 to 45% of a character's max hit points per hit. They should ideally be doing 125% of a character's total hit points in an entire round's worth of combat. You can even increase this number if there are more than 5 creatures facing the boss. Essentially, you want a third of all participants in danger every round that they're fighting a solo boss, and by in danger I mean close to 0 or at 0 hit points. Solo bosses need to do a fucking ridiculous amount of damage in order to keep up with D&D 5th edition player characters. And look, if you're just using basic monster stat blocks, you'll have to go many CR levels higher than you would on average, because the CR system is built around multiple monsters fighting basically multiple 5th edition player characters. And I know this damage seems scary, but you can afford to down your PCs every single round with a solo boss monster in 5th edition. They have more actions than you, they can heal. You need to make boss fights seem a lot closer than they are, because really, the players hold all the cards. You are fighting with your hands tied behind your back when you're just running one solo boss monster. Because honestly, if your party has 2 or more healers, they'll be fine. You just need to make sure that you can keep up and continue to put pressure. The party needs to constantly feel like when this creature's turn comes around, it's going to output damage and the combat's going to swing. So they have to get their damage in and do whatever they're going to do before Doomsday comes at initiative, I don't know, whatever, every single round. Make them fear this monster. Make them fear its potential and its damage, because when the damage is high enough, and it is just contained in this one monster, you can really push your players. Or at least that's what your players will think. In actuality, they were actually in very little danger because they could keep on healing and could ideally have lasted maybe another 2 or 3 rounds with that creature and still have been fine. But at the end of the combat, they'll all look at their, character sheets and say, wow, we have, less than 10% of our hit points. That was a really close fight. Nah, the boss monster just got you low, but you're going to keep picking yourselves back up. So you can afford to have more damage in general. And really, what is damage? This is a question that I kind of have been asking myself for a while. And for me, I think that damage in 5e is a ticking clock. It's how close you are to failure, because that's what 0 hit points means. It means failure. If all of your characters in a party drop to 0 hit points, in most circumstances you will have failed, or will have encountered a failure. It might not be total failure, but you failed. You failed the combat, you did not win, you lost, pretty much. So, however many hit points you have left, combined with how much damage the enemy are doing, is a rough amalgamation of, again, that ticking clock, how close you are to not winning. And as DMs, we set the pace in which the clocks tick with our damage, with that output. We set the pace of how quickly a combat will go. Look, if you're a DM that really just does not like long combats, but you want to still run these really tense combats, have monsters with overall low hit point totals but do a fucking ridiculous amount of damage. You will have combats that will go for 1 to 2 rounds and will be as close as 3 to 4 round combats with this system. As a DM, when you are calculating damage and when you are making these monsters, you should be thinking, what is the pace of the combat? How do I want my players to experience this combat? The damage that these creatures are doing is going to set the experience. It's going to set at what pace the clock ticks and how the players are going to experience the monsters and the world. So keep that in mind when you're planning your combats in the future. And I know this probably seems like a lot, but it really becomes second nature, and I highly suggest just setting up a Google Sheets or Excel spreadsheet and just laying all of the party information out so that you can easily look back and say, all right, I need these amount of minions, they're going to do this damage, and it's going to go and fly right by as you just on the fly calculate what all your monsters are going to need. And if you're looking for your monsters to be more thematic in combats, may I suggest this video right here. It's one of my personal favorites, and thank you for entering the dungeon.